A Prayer Against Apathy by Nicholas de Agosto. Nature is only ever at work. Take stock of the world around you, constantly in movement, each action suited to its need, suited to its end. Fire with its ferocity, veracity, devours, ignites, it roars its presence and illumines the front. From it, people recoil. It singes and scars, but it also clears space. Some of us must act like fire. Water with its elegant, erosive powers, steady is the flow of its work. With direction, sustainability, a river is what nourishes and carves, not a typhoon which destroys indiscriminately, receives and leaves the people in drought. Some of us must act like water. Earth, with its food to eat and generative soil, its many forms of living companions to comfort us in times of solitude and loss. Earth rejuvenates and holds us. Some of us must act like earth. Air so integral to all of us, we must remind ourselves to notice our breath. Not one of us lives without it. Not one of us is untouched by it. It cannot help but give and forgive. Single-minded, it knows everything as one. Some of us must act like air. May we each model in our natures the best in nature, eternally changing, knowing only movement and an urge to create life.
I'd now like to invite Mike Allen and then Jim Henry up to speak about climate change. Together with his wife, Pat, Mike founded the Florence Climate Emergency Campaign and strikes in front of City Hall every Friday. Their primary goal is to get the city of Florence to recognize we have a climate emergency and to take action. Jim initially followed his multi-generational family tradition by working as a commercial fisherman. At age 30 though, he wanted to become a part of the solution rather than the problem and went to work for Greenpeace. He has been an environmental activist ever since. So welcome, Mike.
Okay.
Come on up.
There's a story behind that, but I'm not including it here. You can ask me after the. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
I'd rather
Yes.
not have to hold the mic. So our theme for today's talk is saving our Earth. So, but first I wish to thank Rick Cote and Jim Henry. Rick asked me and Jim to come to you today and present at this service to talk to you about the important work we do collectively as climate activists. We recognize the fact that the Earth is on fire, figuratively and literally, and that much needs to be done to put out the flames. In my work with elders, and that has some symbol of that octogenarian, I've met many UUs who advocate for action against climate change. Like me, they view climate change as a critical moral issue that requires immediate and significant steps to mitigate its effects. Essentially, we believe humans have a responsibility to protect the planet and its inhabitants. FOOF members have, I love that term, FOOF, have been longtime supporters of our cause. Ann Lathrop, and I'm sorry I don't see her today here, but she involved FOOF members 5 years ago by getting them to sign our climate petition. Mark Levy, Mark made the FOOF available to us for bringing in many outside speakers, and I thank you for that, Mark. I thank you all for your commitment, but a lot more is needed. In preparing for my remarks, I came across a quote by Gus Speth. He's a former dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He said, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystems collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness and greed, and those, and the subject of our talk, apathy. As a former scientist, I can relate to this dilemma. Science has the tools to save our Earth from this existential threat of climate change. But do we as people have the will to use them? I have found that apathy is the #1 reason we don't override the selfishness and greed of those in power. I will explore ways we can address the apathy and describe local actions that can help make the transformation necessary to save our Earth. After my remarks, Jim will join us and discuss the need for a spiritual transformation. But first, I will reveal some of my own history to show what drove me to become an activist. Many of you know me as an environmental climate activist, but my activism began long ago and for a very different cause. Pat and I, we met in the 50s in Harrison, New York, and became high school sweethearts. We were married in 1961, add that up, 63 years together as a married couple. When I was a student at Michigan State University studying electrical engineering, and our adventure began then. In the early 60s, I proudly took my family from the East Coast, where we grew up, to California, where as a young ensign in the Naval Reserves, I served as an instructor for Admiral Rickover in his nuclear power school. Following the Navy, and that was a 4-year stint, I attended Cornell University studying radiophysics at the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico. That was a fun time. Over the next decade, we had 3 more children, and my work took me from Massachusetts to Colorado, where I was a radar data analyst for NORAD in the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. I think some of you might know it. It was while in Colorado in the 80s that I first became an activist. My oldest daughter was leaving school. She has an intellectual disability, and her only option was to work in a sheltered workshop run by Goodwill. I learned that a new concept called supported community employment was surfacing nationwide, but not in our hometown of Colorado Springs. Goodwill would not do it. That injustice was a tipping point that led me to becoming a disabilities rights activist. Our struggles over the next several years centered on empowering people with disabilities so their voices and demands for self-determination would be heard. Many times they were ignored. So we looked at the tactics used by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others during the civil rights movement in the 60s. Dr. King believed that nonviolent direct action was a constructive way to force a community to confront an issue. He believed that the form of action could lead to negotiate and ultimately justice. In his own words, quote, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue." Well, the disability movement also found it necessary to employ direct action tactics. In Colorado Springs, a coalition consisting of people with intellectual, mental, and physical disabilities Their family members and activists conducted a direct action protest demanding the right to serve on the boards of agencies that serve them. 3 years later, our statewide collective actions result in legislation that guaranteed people with developmental disabilities the right to be in decision-making positions. By the way, my daughter is now in a host home in Aurora, Colorado, doing very well. I learned valuable lessons from my experiences in Colorado. Upon reflection, I see that what drove me to become an activist, what was also drove Dr. King, the need to right an injustice. The civil rights movement continued long after Dr. King's death under the leadership of activists like John Lewis, who famously said, and I have a shirt that says this, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. My climate activism began 7 years ago. I'm talking about my climate now, right here in Florence, when I asked then Mayor Joe Henry to become a climate mayor. Henry declined, saying he would not embarrass the president. And you know who the president was 7 years ago. He's back. Henry's refusal to act was a tipping point for me, another one, that led to my becoming a climate activist. Today, my frustration stems from the fact that there is no opportunity to have any meaningful public discussions and negotiations with city leaders and their committees. It also comes from the injustice of our elected officials in ignoring the climate crisis and refusing to do something about it. I recently heard a presentation from Tom Kearns from Yaha, it's another elder, that gives us several reasons and ways to move forward. Tom is a retired philosophy professor, as well as a founder and director of the Environmental and Human Rights Advocacy, that's international. Tom gave a presentation on climate-related initiatives for the local governments at a recent Elders Climate, that's us, Elders Climate Action Oregon chapter meeting that I hosted. He described the human rights obligations of local governments, provided several initiatives a local government could take to meet these obligations, and finally offered some strategic and motivation that could help solve a local government and move them to action. Tom emphasized that governments have a climate obligation, and this is important, to its kids,
Yes.
to its citizens,
Yes.
and we have kids back there.
Yes.
Great, I love it. And to the primary purpose of government, which is to protect us and make us safe. But why do governments need to live up to these obligations? Tom went on and said, one important reason is to demonstrate to the children themselves and their families that cities care for its children and their rights, particularly their right to a healthy environment and a stable climate. The Lancet, L-A-N-C-E-T, I've never heard of it before, but it's one of the world's oldest medical journals. Oh, okay, you all know it, great.
Yeah.
Surveyed 10,000 youth ages 16 to 25 from around the world. They found that kids across all countries were worried about climate change. More than 50% reported the following emotions. It's a long list: sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. The latter I'd have to explore why they would feel that. It would be more us, wouldn't it? 75% said that they think the future is frightening, and 83% said that people have failed to take care of the planet. To sum it up, our young people feel abandoned by government and adults. So what can cities do? Cities can declare a climate emergency. 2,364, I love that number, governments in 40 counties already have declared emergencies covering approximately 1 billion people, about 12% of the global population. Not very, we need more, right? So 206 of those governments are in the US, and that includes Portland and Milwaukee. Before anything can be accomplished, cities must acknowledge we are in a global climate crisis and that we must act at the local level. A second and most important follow-up action for cities to do is to develop a comprehensive, science-based human rights respecting climate action plan. Tom suggests we use as a template the citizens-initiated Lincoln County Climate Action Plan that includes human rights norms that he wrote. These norms require we follow the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history. The treaty is legally binding. It's legally binding for those that signed it, that outlines the rights of all children under 18. The U.S. is not. It's verified. They signed it, but they didn't validate it. So Tom Curran made his case from a human rights perspective, with a special emphasis on protecting these rights for our children and grandchildren who will inherit the earth long after we're gone. By the way, there is a bill that's going before the legislature to guarantee, get it into the Constitution, that right. And I can bring that back to the FOOF for a later time. So why these big asks? Why not move in smaller, concrete steps? I believe we need to transition from thinking small and take on bigger, impactful tasks. As an example, in the Lane County Climate Action Plan, and we have a good one, a first key step was to inventory the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted not just by county government, by all sources, such as transportation and building, which are the biggest contributors. When I was deciding what to do after Trump took us out of the Paris Agreement the first time, I came across an article from the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado. I heard Colorado mentioned earlier. They concluded that we could reach 2/3 of the Paris Climate Agreement goals if all our cities and businesses pledge to address climate change. That inspired me to write a petition to the Florence City Council asking them to acknowledge the climate crisis and write a climate action plan that was previously mentioned. Yet many of us aren't concerned enough to take the major action, and that includes our city council and mayor. Why? In part, it's because fossil fuel corporations and now many of our governments have created a political environment that promotes doing things piecemeal or not at all. So I'm wrapping up here. Oops, gotta get my numbers right. I knew this was gonna happen. Good. But nature's systems are blinking red, as you know. Incremental measures mean more death. Immediate, bold, decisive action is the only possible response to a crisis that otherwise will obliterate whole swaths of habitable Earth. Recognizing this dilemma, the National Unitarian Universalist encourages local UUs to engage in advocacy and activism. This is right out of their handbook. That calls for political lobbying, supporting environmental organizations, here's one, and participating in protests to push for policy change. Protests. But how do we deal with apathy? Our own and that of those in elective office. The first step is to recognize and accept the fact that we are in a global climate crisis and that we all must take actions, both as individuals and collectively with other doing it with others is very important. But by the self, only for yourself, is not enough. So to effect systemic actions, we must organize and do what it takes to make our government act. Many have taken a good first step by signing that climate petition, many of you in this room. And we've already pointed out what it asked for. It asked to recognize the seriousness of climate change, but we also have a lot of convincing to do beyond the petition. Some stepped up to another level, attending our climate strikes. Right here, Pat too, in front of city halls. We strike to offset the apathy of the citizens that pass by with our messages. But our primary target is the elected officials for the city. So how's that going? How's that going? Not very well. Our mayor at a city club meeting recently declared that climate change is a low priority. In a communication to me, Mayor Ward said he does not believe there is a global climate crisis. Remember I said that's an important first step. But hopefully there will be a majority in city council. We have a new member that's going to come that disagree with that assessment and are open to do what the petition asked for. We need to get past our own apathy and show the council members that we have their backs. Do this by joining us at Climate Strikes, writing letters encouraging them to take action, especially the actions called for in our climate petition. Better yet, this is the hard part, attend council meetings in large numbers and have several people give verbal public comments. This is something Councilor Wantz has repeatedly asked us to do. Not necessarily on this issue, but in general. These actions can't be a one-shot. They have to be repeated over and over again. I often refer to my mantra to keep me motivated. It says, be persistent, be consistent, and most importantly, be insistent. And I think it's the latter that we're at the stage. We start with education, then we double that, and now we're in the point where we have to triple it. So the future health and safety of children is dependent on what we do now to protect our planet from the ravages of climate change. So please, please, reassess your level of apathy and do what you can. I close with a quotation from Jane Goodall. Quote, "The greatest danger to our future is apathy. Never give up. There's always a way forward. Never lose hope. For if we lose hope, we fall into apathy and do nothing." Thank you so much. I'll leave that
You know, I really have to thank Mike a lot. Have to thank him for being there on Friday afternoons. And I'm sure that all of us have probably seen Mike and Pat and others that I see in the audience here today were doing what they were doing, and to convince me, as I was driving by, to stop. You know, I've been a climate activist. I've been arrested numerous times for actions to save the climate. But that was years ago. And because of my occupation as a commercial fisherman, I have a vested interest in saving this planet. We all have a vested interest in saving this planet. So I think we have an obligation, all of us, to return to the Earth community. And that means that for many of us on the planet, re-engaging with nature, because I think we've gotten away from it. And learning from nature, because the solutions to the problems that we're facing can only be found in our relationship to the Earth. Our intellectual, our technological solutions can work to a certain extent, but they won't solve the major problem until we are in relationship to the rest of life on the planet. Because we are the only species that does not understand how to be a member of the Earth community. So, you know, I grew up on an island in Maine. I was surrounded by nature. And nature was my refuge. So, I have a great respect for that relationship that I have with nature. And it was that respect that made me inquire about that relationship. I asked myself, how did we get here as a society? How did we get in this mess? Because if you don't know how you got here, you don't know how to get yourself out of it. So I happened to pick up a book in my late teens, and it was written by Rachel Carson.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure a good portion of you folks have probably read the book. And I was just blown away. Because I hadn't realized, I was seeing what was happening around me because I spend my life involved with the natural processes that allowed me to make a living and feed my family. But I hadn't realized the extent of the damage that was being done to that planet, to my planet, until I read Silent Spring. It's interesting, and what really struck me was the inscription on the beginning of the book, which is a poem part of a poem by John Keats. And it goes, "The sedge is withered from the lake, and no bird sang. No bird sang. It's interesting that Rachel dedicated the book to Albert Schweitzer, who a Nobel Peace Prize winner for his work on philosophy called The Reverence of Life. He did a lot of other things that were remarkable as a human being, but he said, man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. It was shocking. It was mind-blowing. Yeah. So I had to get involved. And starting from my early 20s, when I was commercial fishing off the coast of Maine, until I reached about 30, I saw incredible changes in the environment around me. Rapid changes in the ocean ecosystem, the amount of fish that were available, the number of species that were in decline. And tying that in with what Rachel Carson was telling me, I'm going, we're in serious trouble. We gotta do something about this. But I had a fishing boat, I had a huge mortgage. I mean, I don't know if you remember what interest rates were like in the late 70s, 18%. Yeah, I was working for the bank. I had a $500,000 mortgage on a boat. I had to catch a lot of fish to pay for you know. I got to the point where I said, this is stupid. You know, I've always been an activist. Fishing wasn't my only involvement, even at an early age. But, you know, I remember a quote by Eldridge Cleaver, one of the members of the Black Panthers, that said, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
That's right.
So I said, well, I'm gonna be part of the solution now. I walked away from my boat, mortgage. Well, the bank can do whatever they wanted with it. And I joined Greenpeace. Started out on the East Coast, working on a toxics campaign, which was perfect for my tie-in with Rachel Carson. We did campaigns against major polluters, Allied Chemical, Monsanto, and our tactics were to shut them down. We would design means by which we could plug their outfalls, which they absolutely need in order to keep production going. We would go in the middle of the night with devices to plug those outfalls, and we would wait until alarms would start going off and investigations were taking place and authorities were called. So we got arrested. And we went to jail, and lots of times, I don't know how many times I got arrested on the East Coast, but lots of times the police would thank us. You know, you don't often get arrested and have the police say, you know, we really appreciate what you're doing. They said, we live in a neighborhood where we can hardly breathe. You know, we're choking here. And so we knew we were getting plenty of press for this. And getting the information out to people about the damage that was being done. And you know, it's called direct action. And it really works. And Mike was saying it really works. It does work. My last campaign with Greenpeace was in the Bering Sea. We initially went up on the Rainbow Warrior, which was the Greenpeace flagship at the time, to do a campaign against high seas pirate drift netting for salmon. Pretty much on the international date line east of Attu, which is the last island, out on the Aleutian chain. And these boats would come from Asia, from North Korea, various other countries. They were illegally setting these huge nets, 20-mile long nets, that were catching not only salmon, seabirds, dolphins, porpoise, whales, and they would get tangled up in these long nets. So what we would do is follow those boats, and as they were setting the nets out, in Zodiacs we would take and lift the nets back up and tie them up so they couldn't sink into the bottom. Well, this really annoyed and you know, they try to ram us and so on and so forth. we had a crew from CNN aboard the boat. They were all Vietnam vets, and they were just as crazy as we were. And, you know, they were out there filming all this stuff, you know, boats coming at them, you know, and ready to collide with us, and, you know, you know, they're filming all this and got it back to Georgia, you know, to their Ted Turner's office, you know, broadcasting network, and got that information out. Then finally, the last thing we did while we were in the Bering Sea was to go to Russia, to the Soviet Union, to try to stop an illegal whaling campaign that the Russians were doing in order to feed this massive mink farm. There was a village that of 100 and something natives, Yupik people on the coast of just east of Nome, Alaska. I mean west, sorry. And they had an allocation of 200 gray whales a year for their take to feed the village. There's 130 people in the village.
Oh my God.
We got that information from Paul Watson. I don't know if you folks have heard of Paul Watson or not, but he had the Sea Shepherd Society, and he did a television program called Whale Wars or something like that. I can't remember exactly. I never saw it. But anyway, Paul got the information for it. It's because he had gone in to Russia the year before and had found this mink farm and knew it, so we knew it was there. So but we had to document it and get the information to the International Whaling Commission. So we went in, we filmed it. 7 of us got arrested in the process. We spent several weeks in the Soviet Union, under guard, waiting for what they were gonna do with us. In the meantime, the Rainbow Warrior made it back to the States. We sent the film that was showing the whole operation to the International Whaling Commission in the Netherlands, and they cut the gray whale quota to 2 whales a year.
Wow.
And they got the message, we got the message out of what was going on. So I was inspired to do something because I just felt I had no other choice. And I just want to get the message out to you folks that none of us have a choice at this point. We need to do something. We really need to do something. And as we progress as a community, we'll figure that out. You know, Mike's talking about direct action, things we can do in Florence to make a difference. So I'm hoping that as we progress as a community, we'll work together to figure that out. Thank you.